Very good. So as Arild noted, C4 has been working on a global comparative study on REDD over the past 7 years, and what I'd like to do is give you a brief update on some of our findings. And so this should cover a bit of the past and present dimensions of the topic that we're discussing today, and hopefully open up some directions for the discussion for the future. REDD has gone through, I guess, what we would call a typical Gartner type of hype cycle. And the Gartner cycle is often applied to technologies, and I think we can certainly apply it to the ideas behind REDD, where it goes through an early inception phase and then a peak of inflated expectations. And we had that, I think, with some of the reports around, for example, the Stern report, where it was going to be quick, cheap, and easy, low cost, cost-effective way of getting action started, easy way to bridge until we get onto the harder things to do with fossil fuels. After peaks of inflated expectations, you, of course, go through a trough of disillusionment. And that's when the finance doesn't materialize. The early starters have to develop a plan B. No new projects fail to materialize. Following this, you actually, hopefully, I mean, there is one alternative. You could crash and burn, and that downward line could continue all the way to the x-axis. But typically, you find what we call a slope of enlightenment, where wizened actors who have gained some experience begin to undertake more constructive and more realistic types of activities, hopefully kicked off by COP21 decisions. Between 2015 and 2020, hopefully we'll see us move up towards the plateau of productivity. And I guess we all expect to be somewhere on that plateau of productivity by 2020, when the new climate change agreement is supposed to take effect, and the world is supposed to work across countries to tackle the problems of climate change and make real progress on the ground. Now, I'd like to kick off a little bit with the theory of change that we've been using in the global comparative study, and we've applied a political economy lens to this. The idea is that there's a nested set of policy arenas. There's an international policy arena, and when we're here present at that in the UNFCC, that's connected with national policy arenas. A lot of what happens in the national policy arenas influences the international and vice versa. What we're actually trying to achieve is transformational change. So we're trying to go from business as usual to something different, to a better situation. And central to that, we have actors. And do I get a, so I've got an arrow here. So you have actors at the center of this. And these actors make decisions and investments and take actions based upon three things: on ideas, on interests, and on information that they have. And they do this all within the institutional context of their own countries and their own sectors, their economic sectors. And so we call this the 4 Eyes framework, and we've been trying to understand the different ideas, interests, information, and how institutions help shape decisions that actors make, and then how these things can be configured to actually have actors make different decisions. So I'd like to just run a bit through the key areas of some of our findings. So one of our research areas is on national policy programs. We've analyzed 13 national REDD programs. We find that 6 of the countries that we've analyzed have actually put in place comprehensive policies targeting transformational change in REDD+. We don't define success at the moment with emissions reductions on the ground. That has not happened. Countries are still basically going through the transformation process and dealing with things at the policy level, and so that's where we're looking right now. But we see that there are critical issues that hinder countries in achieving REDD+, and these are often related to policy implementation. It's easy to make a policy. It's much more difficult to implement that policy. Some of the issues are associated with lack of grievance procedures and protection of individual interests, lack of operationalized financial systems, and the finance, as we'll see in a couple of more slides, is actually a major roadblock at the moment. Of the 6 countries that actually had policies in place to facilitate REDD and bring about a more rational use of forests, 3 have actually put in place performance-based finance for REDD+. And we find that the availability of performance-based funds has a positive impact when it's combined with strong national ownership of the REDD+ process. We often say that strong national ownership is required, and we often treat it as a throwaway line, but the evidence suggests that is actually the case, and that when there is national ownership, performance-based finance can make a difference. However, where there is not national ownership and where the agenda is largely driven by donors, countries still can achieve progress, and they can do it without performance-based funding. And so we see that where REDD commitment is externally driven, non-performance-based funding has an effect that's more or less equal to that of performance-based funding. So external actors are able to put in place incentives that bring about the policy changes. I'd like to talk a little bit about our work on REDD demonstration activities. We've looked at 23 subnational REDD initiatives in 6 countries. We've undertaken studies in 190 villages and with 4,500 households, and these projects are mapped here in the panel. So you can see there's a large concentration in Indonesia, Vietnam, Tanzania, and Cameroon in Africa, and Brazil and Peru in Latin and South America. And this is how these projects have more or less shaped up. So we've looked at what sorts of interventions have been put in place. And many of them are working on what we call enabling conditions. These include things like recognizing land tenure and solving some of the land tenure problems. There are a number of actions around disincentives, and there are many actions around incentives. And I want to be careful here. The fact that there are more actions around incentives than disincentives doesn't mean that projects are necessarily relying more heavily on incentives. Projects the disincentives actually tend to be much more global and one size fits all, whereas the incentives actually need to match to livelihood strategies and livelihood activities. So they're much more variable when projects put them in place. So we see lots of different types of activities on the incentive side and a more restricted number of activities on the disincentive side, but the disincentive is still an important part of the process in achieving in what these projects are put in place. But the other take-home message here is that the projects that are being put in place because of the lack of international REDD finance are very much in the mold of the integrated conservation and development types of projects that have been in place for the past 15 or 20 years around the globe. And we also see that there is learning and there's increased participation. We began the studies in 2010, which was really the very early days of REDD+, and that the knowledge has grown over time, knowledge at the base in the villages, knowledge among women's groups, knowledge in households, and participation is growing over time as well in these demonstration activities. So we're seeing both learning and participation increase as people find that these approaches actually serve their interests. There are a number of multi-level governance challenges that are emerging. REDD+ is now moving towards a more nested and jurisdictional type of approach or other national types of approaches, and there's more recognition that local action is required, not just national policies and national actions. So REDD requires coordination across these levels. It requires coordination for finance and benefit sharing, for carbon monitoring, for verification systems, land tenure and titling policies, safeguards, and so on. So there's really a need to build in place more understanding and more connections from what's happening at the national policy arena to the subnational policy arenas. And all this requires integrating notions of power. So despite diverse legal and decentralization systems, powerful actors with a stake in deforestation often figure out how they can get their way, unsurprisingly. And they either use or they circumvent the rules that are being put in place. Most REDD and REDD-like efforts are trying to change the behavior typically of the weaker actors, not the stronger actors. Right? And the political will and coalitions for change are indispensable for advancing REDD+ and low emissions development. One of the technical areas that has been a constraint is measurement, reporting, and verification. And we've undertaken a study using the FAO fraud data because the FAO fraud data is fairly, it's consistent and frequent enough across time, and all countries participate. And so what we've done here is map out the areas, the countries between 2005 and 2010 in the top panel, and the countries in between 2010 and 2015 that have actually made progress in MRV. And in the paper that Erica Romin wrote with us, she actually unpacks this quite a lot, and it's clear that countries are now undertaking more and more national forest inventories, and they're getting a much better handle on the area of their forest. They're not doing such a good job on the carbon and the carbon quantification associated with that. But in the absence of payments for specific emissions reductions, maybe that's good enough right now. And understanding trends when we're not talking about actually selling individual carbon credits or paying for a ton of emissions reductions, that this progress is really appropriate and fairly productive. And so the MRV issues are no longer the obstacle that they were in the past. And more data sets are coming online to help countries improve their MRV. This is a data set that Veronica Deci published just earlier this week, where she's looked at the drivers of deforestation across South America and the emissions associated with that. And she has data sets over different periods of time. This should help countries target, if you understand the drivers, they can target their policies better, but also have an understanding of how the drivers and the emissions associated with the drivers are evolving over time. So this is just a very brief summary of the type of work we're doing, and I'd just like to advertise that we do have 4 edited volumes on REDD+, freely available on our website. The most recent one is REDD+ on the ground, which really looks at these subnational demonstration activities. And so I would just invite you all to consult our work, download it, and provide feedback. We like to hear from people that what they think are new things that we need, new types of analyses we need to undertake to support the process. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Lou. Yeah, I didn't plan to have that slide hanging on. The next speaker is Christine Dragisic. I choose to pronounce your name that way. I think it's close to the original. She's a REDD negotiator for the United States. She works at Foreign Affairs Officer at the US Department of State. I think you're also representing your country in the FCPF and the Biocarbon Fund, and have a career before, and diverse, I would say, both the World Bank and Conservation International. So you've been asked to come here also to update us a little bit what happened in the northern part of Paris, where the COP is going on, and is REDD, was it completed really 2 years ago? So it's just some putting the icing on the cake now, or what are the REDD debates at the current COP? The floor is yours.
Thanks, Arild. A nice, easy question to start the day with, right?
Sí, no es una pregunta muy fácil, ¿no? Para empezar el día. Buenas tardes a todos. Yo quisiera volver un poquito atrás y hablar de la evolución de REDD hasta ahora, y luego comentaré un poco cuál es la situación actual, y si tienen preguntas después, con mucho gusto responderé. Hay muchos de los aquí presentes que llevan años siguiendo el REDD+, pero yo no. Yo llegué un poco después de Cancún concretamente, y quizás ha sido incluso positivo, porque las decisiones de Cancún, pues desde luego establecieron las normas básicas de REDD+, dieron forma a lo que es el REDD+, es una especie de marco, y el mundo empezó a ver el REDD de otra manera, empezó a alejarse de ese eje en el mercado de carbono y a plantearse cómo entraba el REDD+ en este espacio climático que evoluciona tan rápido. Los 2 o 3 años siguientes, pues tuve la suerte de participar en las negociaciones que se centraban en los temas clave que emanaban de Cancún, por ejemplo, las normas para los niveles de referencia, las salvaguardas, decisiones de financiación de todo tipo, financiación de todo tipo que puede acompañar el REDD+, y desde luego es básico contar con este apoyo para acompañar los esfuerzos sobre el terreno. Y más allá de las negociaciones, pues el eje, digamos, de la temática era la aplicación y ver cómo poner en marcha las estrategias y los sistemas. Y quizás, aún más importante, la capacidad y las alianzas necesarias para que el REDD+ se convirtiera en una realidad sobre el terreno. Mucho de todo esto se estaba dando en países con selvas tropicales, pero también había asociaciones multilaterales y bilaterales que acompañaban todas estas acciones. En 2013, pues acordamos un marco REDD+ con una serie de decisiones que captaban las directrices, las guías básicas de el REDD+ bajo la Convención Marco del Cambio Climático. Teníamos las cuestiones técnicas, las decisiones sobre salvaguardas sociales y medioambientales, y los vínculos con las distintas formas de financiación necesarias para impulsar el REDD+ a otra etapa nos quedaban 3 temas pendientes y en junio, en la reunión de Bonn, acordamos 3 proyectos de decisión que esperamos se finalicen, se ultimen aquí y se adopten aquí en París. Y bueno, pasa entonces el eje, digamos, a la aplicación plena en esta etapa. Y más allá de la negociación, pues se ha avanzado muchísimo. Yo creo que el avance quizás no es, eso es un poco desigual, pero casi todos los países están avanzando, hay sistemas ya en marcha, hay políticas, hay legislación que se está aprobando y articulando, hay estrategias ya definidas, alianzas que surgen entre gobiernos, sociedad civil, pueblos indígenas, que en mi opinión son fundamentales, y ya no es únicamente algo que va de abajo arriba ni de arriba abajo, es un proceso que se encuentra a medio camino y que aúna ambos enfoques. También está el sector privado que se está implicando. Esta semana mismo escuchamos a Marks Spencer y Unilever que hicieron un anuncio en el que decían que van a priorizar sus fuentes de materias primas en áreas donde se esté aplicando programas de paisajes de REDD+. O sea que vemos cómo el poder de la fuerza de los mercados mundiales también puede acompañar los esfuerzos de REDD+, y esto, en mi opinión, tiene mucho valor. La industria financiera también está empezando a considerar este terreno como un terreno de oportunidades. Hay distintas iniciativas que están apoyando al REDD+, así que vemos que el sector privado pues está implicando en los esfuerzos de conservación, medidas de acción, medidas climáticas, etcétera. Y en mi opinión esto significa que tenemos muchas más posibilidades de éxito, porque no basta con un solo enfoque, con una fuente de financiación, con una sola vía. No, necesitamos coaliciones masivas, necesitamos muchas fuentes de financiación, necesitamos que todas las comunidades trabajen de la mano y en la misma dirección. Todavía no hemos llegado ahí, pero ya se han identificado los objetivos y se están tomando medidas, y yo creo que eso es lo más interesante que cabría destacar. También estamos empezando a ver, en mi opinión, algo que es muy alentador, y es que ya estamos saliendo de esos compartimentos que antes existían. Yo trabajé en el terreno en programas de gestión de bosques sostenibles, etcétera, y cuando entré en este terreno me llamó la atención de que por un lado estaban los bosques, por el otro lado estaba la agricultura, y eran debates que estaban totalmente separados entre sí y separados también de la economía en su conjunto. Pero esto ha cambiado y mucho. Y ahora estamos, de hecho, en el Foro Mundial de Paisajes. Los paisajes son clave y los Estados Unidos habla de paisajes sostenibles. Es algo que apoyamos desde hace tiempo y queremos un enfoque más integrado. Impulsamos a los países en ese sentido, y sobre el terreno estamos viendo esfuerzos holísticos, integrales, con todos los actores implicados desde el sector.
Integrated land use planning world. So we're looking at all the different mechanisms and all the different actors which are needed to reduce emissions and enhance sequestration and reduce the pressure on forests. And you saw that reflected this year as the INDCs came forward. Almost every national target put forward included land in some way or another. And I think that in and of itself was an incredible sign of how far we've come and how far countries have come in looking at the opportunities to reduce emissions and enhance sequestration. There are challenges. It's difficult to capture all of this here in Paris. We have REDD+ and land reflected in numerous places in the current draft text. To our surprise, there's actually been a bit of pushback against more flexible, more integrated reflection of land for all parties, and that's come from a very few parties, I think, but it's been something we've heard in a lot of the negotiating rooms. We think that there is a need to reflect a very flexible long-term vision if we think about a durable agreement. And so that's one thing that we're hopeful we'll find a path forward on. But the good thing is there's been a very, very constructive engagement by all parties in looking towards language and looking at how we might move forward on that. You'll also note that land and forests are actually integrated throughout the text in words like net emissions reductions, removals, and sinks. So as you read the text, it's actually fascinating that that has become part and parcel of our standard language here in the UNFCCC. We still have a week to go. We don't know quite what we'll come out with, but there's a really good work environment and a really good spirit of cooperation and trying to find a way forward on this, both in our very small rooms looking at REDD+ and land, and in the broader rooms. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any more specific questions later.
Yes. You can be happy and answer one right away.
Oh, good.
No, it's on. Good. One question right away. What is the future role of COPs in kind of setting, in implementing REDD? I mean, a lot of the funding, that is mainly going to happen to the Green Climate Fund. There are new bilateral agreements. REDD is being included by a number of countries in their INDCs. There's a large number of projects by NGOs. What is the specific role of UNFCC in the future in implementing REDD?
I think what's been interesting is that all of us feel that the guidance on REDD Plus has been completed. That was key. And there's a lot of focus on not reopening what was a 10-year process to finalize that. I think the convention still has key roles. One of these is in the national targets. The INDCs included land, included forest, created a whole set of opportunities and incentives to actually take action in this space. And as you look towards the process, as you look towards the subsequent cycles where we hope these become more and more ambitious every 5 years, you will see these incentives increase over time. That's powerful. That's big. The financing linkages are done in part through the operating entities of the financial mechanism of the convention, otherwise the Green Climate Fund and the GEF, both of which include REDD+. And that in and of itself is a really strong sign. There are continued discussions and guidance to the GCF, to the GEF, and those will be ongoing. But we are extremely happy to see that financing is included there. And then there are ongoing discussions about markets and cooperative approaches. Those may well have additional incentives for REDD depending on where they go in the future.
Great. One of the initiatives that have been running in parallel with the UNFCCC process is the initiative that William Boyd is going to talk about, the Governor's Climate and Task Force, or the Governance Climate and Forest Task Force, to be exact. William is a senior advisor to that initiative, and is also a law professor at the University of Colorado and doing research on legal and institutional requirements for implementation of REDD. So please.
Thank you, Arild. I think I have one slide I wanted to show, just a map of the GCF, if that's okay. And I should say, when we say GCF, we mean Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force. We do need to work on our acronym, obviously, especially when we are in UNFCCC territory, so we're working on that. This is the, I just wanted to show this one slide. This is a map of the states and provinces, the 29 states and provinces that are members of the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force. That was created in 2009, largely led by Governor Schwarzenegger in California, coming out of his first climate summit in the fall of 2008. And it includes a number of leading jurisdictions around the world in tropical forest, countries like Brazil and Indonesia, Mexico, Peru, and elsewhere, that are building jurisdictional approaches to REDD+ and low emissions development. It includes California, obviously. That is the only jurisdiction in the world that is actively considering including REDD as part of its greenhouse gas compliance program. So maybe we can talk more about that in a little bit. We have been sort of looking at this whole world of REDD+ and low emissions development largely outside of the UNFCCC process, but we certainly recognize the great fundamental importance of what is happening in the UNFCCC and the negotiations, and hope very much that we get a very positive outcome here in Paris. My view on this is that REDD+ started as a relatively simple, very abstract idea that quickly started to travel around the world in all kinds of different directions and ended up in all kinds of different places and took on all different kinds of meanings and took on a lot of complexity along the way. And so again, I think it's something that has escaped out beyond the confines of the UNFCCC, but is in some ways very much connected to what is happening here as well. And that makes it difficult to get your arms around it. It makes it difficult to really understand what you're talking about when you're talking about REDD+. Is it just a carbon credit mechanism, or is it something much broader than that? We take a broader approach, I think, in the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force in thinking about REDD+ as part of, but just part of, a broader agenda of low emissions development. And I think our view is that this is still up for grabs. It's still getting worked out in all kinds of different places through the vernacular institutions and the local landscapes of particular places around the world. Very different legal systems, very different institutions and norms, obviously, in a lot of these places, that's going to affect how it gets worked out. And so I think what Chris was saying about flexibility and creating opportunities for this to work with the institutions that are out there on the ground is very important. I just want to say a couple things about what we've learned in the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force over the last 7 years. One, and I think we can come back to this maybe in the second round, is that REDD Plus must be part of a broader agenda of low emissions development. And maybe we should think about not using the term REDD Plus if it's too confusing or takes on too much baggage or meanings with other processes that are happening. But fundamentally, this has to be part of a broader agenda. Two, the jurisdictional approach is critical, and this is a big part of what we've been trying to build and support within the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force. It's critical as a platform or a vehicle for bringing multiple stakeholders and processes together for moving that broader agenda forward. And there's no way to predict where that's going to go or how fast it's going to move, obviously. Sometimes it falls apart. Sometimes it takes off in ways that were unexpected. And I think that's a really important part of this, and an important opportunity, too, for thinking about how some of these private sector initiatives perhaps can start to sync up with or link up with these jurisdictional approaches, the idea of preferential sourcing that Chris was just talking about. This takes time. It takes a lot of time. This is a long game. It requires political leadership, courageous political leadership, but it also requires building capacity and strengthening and empowering the networks of civil servants and their civil society partners underneath that. And our theory of change is really that it's those civil servants and the civil society partners that really are the glue of a jurisdictional approach that's going to keep this moving forward, however slowly and however many winding road it is, that they're really critical to really keeping a jurisdictional approach intact, particularly as you get political turnover, right? Governors come and go, political leaders come and go, and priorities change. But keeping that sort of set of civil servants and their civil society partners connected and moving forward, I think is a really important thing here, and important because none of us really know what the future is going to hold here. Nobody can really predict with certainty whether or not a REDD mechanism will come together and what it will look like and how flows of finance will move, et cetera. And so the conditions of possibility are something that we should be focused on so that when an opportunity arises, you have a jurisdictional system, a set of institutions and actors in place that can move and take advantage of that tactical opportunity. I think that's a really important part of this when we think about it as an institutional design question. The last thing I'll say, too, is that diversity is a good thing, and it may be that we have maybe too much diversity in some people's minds. There's a very interesting paper that William Sunderland and others have just done with C4 on the challenges of a polycentric approach to governance and taking REDD and building on the comparative study that Lou and others have been leading. Too much fragmentation can make things very difficult to scale, obviously. But diversity is also a source of innovation and experimentation, and I think that's another thing that we need still, much more experimentation with a whole range of different things in the context of REDD Plus and low emissions development, and we find that that's a big part of what's exciting about the work that we do, and hope very much that whatever comes out of Paris and the international agreement or mechanism or framework on REDD Plus, that it will continue to enable and support some of those experiments. Obviously, this is going to happen in different ways in different places depending on the structure of federalism in certain countries and whether or not you're a federal system or not, et cetera. But that kind of enabling and support and de-risking of those kinds of experiments, I think, is a really important path going forward. So, thank you, Arild.
Thank you. The jurisdictional approach that you're developing and putting the states and provinces at the forefront, it was in part a response to national governments moving a bit too slowly, at least for some of the countries you're involved in. But aren't you quickly hitting the constraints that you work within a national legislation, a national set of policies, and there is just so much that provinces or states can do? Or is that constraint you're fitting and really feeling in your work? Or do you think that there's so much that can be done that it's not really a hard-hitting constraint?
Well, I think it varies, and so I think, again, depending on the particular type of structure that you're talking about, there are, in the GCF, we have states and provinces that are relatively robust in terms of their authority, and federal systems like United States, Brazil, Mexico. We also have states and provinces from countries like Peru and Indonesia, which are not federal systems, and there needs to be a sort of different set of relationships. We've always viewed state-national alignment or subnational-national alignment as a critical way forward. That is the only way this is going to work. And I guess there's a tension there in terms of how much diversity, how much innovation you can get at the state and provincial level ultimately as national policy starts to consolidate. And absolutely, to the extent that national policy is consolidating, again, states and provinces are going to hopefully harmonize with that. Things are working out in different ways in different countries for sure, and there are some constraints, but there are also some opportunities here. I will say, though, that if you look at kind of the subnational level of governance, you look at the Under 2 MOU, you look at the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force, NRG 4SD, the Climate Group, there are a whole bunch of networks of different subnational initiatives out there, and it's these jurisdictions that I think are doing a lot of the hard work. There was a UNDP study that said 50 to 80% of the actual work of mitigation and adaptation is going to be done at subnational levels of government. So they're going to be doing most of the work. Right. And there are also sources of key policy ideas and innovations. And so I think it was really a response to having some strong governors who wanted to push forward with an agenda and trying to build connections among sort of like-minded jurisdictions and political leaders around the world. Obviously, that vertical coordination with the national policy and government and legal frameworks is absolutely critical, and it's going to work out in different ways in different places. We think there can be a productive tension there, but we don't want that ever to tip over into an unproductive confrontational part. But those are going to get worked out individually by the different governments in the different places for sure.
Thanks. One of the countries is Peru, as we just saw on the map here. We are happy to have Gustavo Suarez de Freitas around. He's the executive coordinator of the National Forest Conservation Program for Climate Change Mitigation at the Ministry of Environment. You are the only real forester on the panel who know how to handle a chainsaw and cut a tree in a sustainable way. And you have had a number of positions in the government, so we are happy to hear from you what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity also. I think that Luis provided us a great presentation, a good point for start and comments. No? I think in the evolution he showed, probably we need to include the perception of what REDD is, no? Because at least in my country, there is a shift, no? From the one market aspects leading the REDD's discussion to a more policies aspect leading the discussion. No? And we think that there is probably a number of different phases of REDD. No? And we need to be very clear about what kind of REDD we are talking about. No? Because at the beginning, they start the so-called REDD projects or early actions in REDD, more oriented to selling reduction certificados de... Yeah, well, okay, you understand. For the voluntary market, no? But right now, we believe in REDD more than one of the tools which help us to design and apply policies and measures to stop deforestation in a broader context. No? The first approach, the project's approach, for me, in my current position in the government, is some kind of problem, no? Because the project reference levels and the jurisdictions and national levels hardly match. No? We have a problem there. For instance, in one of our regions, we make a calculation about the potential of REDD emissions reduction. And 2 or 3 projects, private projects, have all the reductions. So it's a problem because it's very difficult to design and implement a good system of benefit sharing if we have this situation. Because REDD needs to show benefits for the whole chain, from the national government, regional government, the local situation, no? And we have a vertical or horizontal distribution of benefits. And this is one problem we see, no? But when we talk about REDD as a national jurisdictional approach, more focusing this land case approach and with a broader context, it could be we believe it could be a good tool for us. But we need to understand and remember that REDD is a tool. It's not an end by itself. And some kinds of discussions are so focused on how to make REDD function and not how to stop deforestation. No? Because we can achieve the same result for different ways. No? And this is one important thing which is very important to share with you, because for us, one of the problems is the different approaches the corporations and the private sector and the private institutions have about regarding REDD, what kind of activities they promote or they support in the country, which are not aligned with our ideas or our policy, how to implement this instrument in the country. No? So we believe this is a very important issue to share with you. And for instance, with the regional governments, we are working very hard in order to design a national mechanism who provides enough room for subnational initiatives and also for private projects. We are not against private projects, but we need to be, the private projects or the regional initiatives must be adequately nested in a national REDD system or something like that. And we are working in the design of this model, but of course we need a lot of help in that issue. But otherwise it would be very difficult to continue with individual or specific projects. And if we continue with these isolated projects, the gap could be bigger between what we need as a country approach and what is happening in the field in the individual projects. No? So this is a very important issue for the REDD implementation in the country. No? Thank you.
Thank you. Just a small question. Do you see, and do I get it right, that you see it's a little bit of a challenge that you have a number of projects being implemented by NGOs, some national, some international, and the government policies that is not properly aligned those two streams of REDD? What steps are you taking to try to harmonize and work more in synergies?
Well, we are trying to have a reference level for the 3 biomes of the country, the Amazon, Andean, and the coastal area. And we are trying to promote all the initiatives use the same reference level in order to avoid problems in the accountability of the carbon. And also, we need to share the benefits in the whole system, no? Because right now the projects are not contributing to the national REDD process or system. They only obtain money for the specific project. No? And in some regions, we have a number of individual REDD projects, but the deforestation is still growing in the region. No? So it's pretty clear that we need to apply national and regional policies and measures to stop deforestation, and this is part of the REDD process, not only the projects. But the money went to the projects, goes to the projects, not for the whole REDD system at a national or subnational level.
Thank you.
We are trying to design a model to include projects, but also to provide some room to share the benefits among all the levels we need to be benefit. No?
Great. The last speaker is Daniel Nepstad, sitting next to me. Maybe you don't need an introduction, but I just say a couple of things. He's president and director of the Earth Innovation Institute, done a lot of work in particularly Brazil, but in South America, and now increasingly also on all the three tropical continents, Indonesia and Africa in particular. Tropical ecologist by background, has written, I think, a few key articles that really shaped our thinking about, for example, the dieback and the drying, what will happen with the trees and biodiversity in the Amazon. That has really framed the debate. Also been involved as a lead author in the IPCC second report on the impacts of climate change. So we look forward to hearing you. Yes. Do you have one or several? I can.
Arild, get to work. Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's late, and a lot of you are probably running out of energy, but I'll try to keep this lively. Oh, there it is. Great. I think we're in the middle of a very exciting period where a lot of the elements of REDD are taking root and really going to scale. Earlier today, there was a signing ceremony for the Under 2 MOU. This is really the California effect expanded, extending into the area of tropical forests, extending into the area of climate change. California effect being when California establishes a fuel standard or pollution standard, it's such a big economy that other economies imitate it, including the United States government. And I think that's a very important concept. Innovation, as William was pointing out, spreads. Successful political leaders become role models for other political leaders who want to imitate their success and tap into those sources of investment, sources of jobs, sources of employment that are really the basis of getting reelected. This particular initiative, which started less than a year ago by Governor Brown's office, basically says if you're willing to get your emissions below 2 tons CO2 per capita by 2050, or reduce your overall emissions 85 to 90%, come on in, sign up. What's interesting is that we have almost 60 signatures and many others queuing up. Sorry, Arild, can we go to the next slide? It'll keep him awake, I think. And if we look at the overall impacts of this, and this is just with those jurisdictions that have already put in their data, most have not, well, about half have not. But we're right now looking at 17 gigatons of emissions reductions by 2030, and more than 55 going into 2050. And more than half of this is coming from the reduction of tropical deforestation. This is a big deal. It's getting us to the scale that we really need to get to avoid a 2 degrees rise of our global average temperature. And I would argue that subnational initiatives are sort of catching up to the international INDC type pledges. And it's not that it's a competition. I think these pledges put upward pressure on the nations in which they're hatched. And they're also a way for those national pledges to find capillarity, to really make it down to the ground. I'd like to focus on one jurisdiction that's responsible for 25% of this overall emission reduction. So Arild, this is your last job, and then you can rest. Notice the baseline across the top. Okay. Thank you, Arild. In southeastern Amazon, there's a 900,000 square kilometer state called Mato Grosso. It's about a third Amazon, a third Cerrado, with a big chunk of Pantanal, a wetland as well. On the 17th of September, Governor Pedro Takis initiated a process together with, in the presence of the Minister of Norway, Tin Sundtoft, and the Minister of Environment of Brazil, Isabella Teixeira. And he basically said, I want to take to Paris a shared agenda for addressing deforestation, but not just deforestation. I want to show how we can increase agricultural production, how we can take our smallholders, lift them out of poverty, increase their incomes, And this is the comment he made today at the signing ceremony of the U2 MOU. But I think the impact of this is quite phenomenal. This builds upon an existing, now it's about a 75% reduction in deforestation in the state. You know, the real data you can see on the left side of that graph. The orange bars being annual deforestation. So there was a while there where half of all the clearing of forests in the Brazilian Amazon took place in Mato Grosso when Amazon soy came into the global market, fed by China's growing imports and mad cow outbreaks in Europe, leading to the end of animal protein in an animal ration. And that has come down. Under Blido Maggi, it began coming down. Under his successor, who now sits in jail, it continued to go down, or at least stayed quite low. But we just had a 16% increase in deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon. A bunch of that happened in Mato Grosso. And I think what's happening is we're running to the end of the command and control approach that has really been critical to Brazil's decline in deforestation. And I think we're also at the end of a paradigm. We need a new paradigm. I'm just curious, how many people, raise your hand if you are from a farm organization or you yourself are a farmer. Could you just raise your hand? 2, 3. Okay, we have a few. That's great. I think we need more of you. I think farmers are sort of the forgotten piece of this equation. I think this workshop here, wonderful to bring together the worlds of agriculture and forests, but this thing in the long term has to work for farmers if it's going to have any resilience. We're seeing the soy moratorium lose gas in Brazil. Why? Because farmers never wanted it. It basically cost them billions of dollars of lost land values to have that requirement imposed upon them. But getting back to the Mato Grosso story. So what I think is fascinating here is that the farm sector endorses this. APRO, Soja, FAMATO were at the table through 2 months of negotiation to come up with these new targets. There is a productivity target, a social inclusion target. There's a deforestation target for both Cerrado and the Amazon. And what these sum up to is 0 emissions by 2030. And what this, if you add it all up, just the forest carbon contribution here is 4 gigatons by 2030, with Mato Grosso already having 2 gigatons under its belt. And that goes up to about 6 gigatons if you include agricultural gases. The point I'm trying to make here, though, is that REDD is one piece. And just as Gustavo said, it is one of the tools of an overall portfolio of strategies and policies that are going to come together to get us to this new reality. It is a new era in which farmers are going to not be operating out of fear of being cut out of markets, fear of being cut out of credit programs, fear of being landed in jail or landed with fines, which is how things work today. They're going to see all of their hard work to intensify production on existing cleared land bring them benefits. That's the potential we have. 2016 is the chance to build that agenda. And this is led by SEMA, the environmental agency of Brazil, with some folks who've been there for 20 years. You know, Elaine Corsini, as William pointed out, she has been the continuity across these political cycles and several other like her. It's not just Mato Grosso. Acre has a very similar process, Pará, Amazonas, etc. If we go to Indonesia, Central Kalimantan has embarked on a very similar road. The county of Suruya recently signed what I believe is the first formal public-private partnership for sustainable palm at the jurisdictional level. The district heads signed up with the four of the IPOP companies and farmer organizations to say, we're going to figure this out together at the jurisdictional level. So this is not an isolated Brazilian thing. It's working elsewhere. REDD is a tool. It's not the end. I agree 100% with that. And if I were to summarize just 3 points, I would say the key one is jurisdictional carrots. You know, we've had too long with negative incentives. We need jurisdiction-wide incentives to create a motive to get the collective action taking place within fairly large jurisdictions that really is where we've gotten big, large-scale success thus far. We could call this getting beyond farmer fear. A second critical piece to this is regional ownership. We might call this the switch to cryptic REDD, where REDD, people don't even talk about it anymore, or it's there and but it's not the overall umbrella. It's not everyone looking to REDD and the global rules, right? It's fully owned and embedded in the society. It's acting to become part of public policies and programs, and it's something that you can get reelected on or elected. Finally, unification. And the unification, I think, has to do with the profusion of definitions of success we have today. Mato Grosso has 8, and farmers are going nuts. And one sort of downside of the profusion of corporate deforestation commitments coming out, and I think they're overall fantastic to have corporations really stepping onto the plate, but there are some big risks with those corporate deforestation pledges. One is that everyone is basically going to come up with its own definition of success, driving farmers and suppliers and other companies further down, closer to the ground, nuts. Do we have to do segregated sourcing for every company? But also, it misses an opportunity to engage with the local political leaders, and that's why I think the announcement is so critical. I think that right now it's been sort of slow for the companies to sit down at the table to just say, well, how can we make this work together? But I also think a focus on absolute zero deforestation could be the perfect really getting in the way of the good. I've yet to meet a farmer who thinks that a zero deforestation supply chain agenda pledge is a good thing. They want to be part of that dialogue, not having the rules imposed upon them. And they have, if they can legally clear a little bit more land, or if they need to do swidden agriculture, which a lot of people do, suddenly they're wondering, are we going to get cut out of this? And we see smallholders already saying that they see that companies are less inclined to work with them. Indonesia and Malaysia came together to say, we reject these corporate pledges. You know, we want to do it our way. So I think we're in a very interesting tipping point that's going to move us in a new direction.
That was interesting and thought-provoking, at least thoughts on how these pledges may exclude to work at the ground. Just one point I would like to pick up. You said the command and control is kind of the area of that is over. You didn't say exactly that. But I was also thinking that in the past, one of the main explanations of why Brazil has reduced deforestation so much is because they have been tough on implementation of the protected areas, of the requirements of having a certain percentage of the farm and the forests. So is it that it's not effective anymore to find people and putting them to jail, or are you more talking about the political feasibility of continuing that approach?
I think it's there's a fatigue building up right now, especially at the farmer level. You know, they want to get on with it. They want recognition. A lot of counties, if you go to the county of Querencia, they came off the blacklist where all of their farmers were cut off from credit. They had credit reestablished, but then where was the recognition? Where was the praise? Where was something easier in their lives? I think so we really need quickly to address the shortage of carrots, of positive incentives. I think the sticks need to continue. We have to have law enforcement. But when demands come in that are above an already very onerous legal framework like the Forest Code, that becomes really problematic, especially if there's not a compensation mechanism there to pay the damages to property values.
Okay, we are going to open for the audience to have, sometimes the presenters like to have questions, as assuming that all the wisdom in the room is assembled among the panelists. Of course, that's not the case. So comments, I would also appreciate that, plus questions. I would discourage you to come with long presentations of your organizations and all the great projects that you have, I'm sure. But comments or questions to the things that we have discussed there. There are 2 microphones. I'd like to start on this side first. There's a lady on the 4th row. If you can go to the microphone over there. Maybe one or two more on this side. Okay.
Hello.
Or we can take the whole floor if... Yeah, okay, please.
Hi, so my name is Heaven Williams and I work for the International Council for Mining and Metals. And my question is, you mentioned that in the UNFCCC discussions, there's been more efforts to engage with business. So I wondered in what way that there were plans or they were currently engaging with the mining sector, but also agribusiness.
Doug Boucher, if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm one of the usual suspects. Doug Boucher from the Union of Concerned Scientists. Several years ago, we were hearing that REDD+ couldn't succeed without large-scale carbon market financing, that was the only way we'd get enough money for it. And yet, we seem to have had a fair amount of success, and when we haven't had success, lack of money doesn't seem to have been the limiting factor. And we certainly don't have big demand for carbon market forest credits. You know, EU doesn't allow them, US doesn't have them, California allows a very small fraction, if at all. Was that argument wrong?
One more question, if anyone. Over here. Sorry. Oh, sorry.
Hi, my name is Michelle De Nevers from the Center for Global Development. This question is probably for William. When do you think that California will actually start to implement international forest offsets? And what potential do you see for linking California with other carbon markets?
There was one here we could take before we take a round. Please. The one on the third row.
Bonjour, je veux parler en portugais parce que je suis du Brésil, de la Floresta da Amazônia, do Amazonas. É uma pergunta, Daniel Nepstad, é uma pergunta, Daniel Nepstad, que me gostaria muito de saber. Amazonas está empezando una revolución de bajísima producción de carbón.
Hello, everyone. Let me tell you about very low carbon production, particularly in forestry and in fruit orchards. Do you know about this project which is being set up today? In other words, not actually implement deforestation, take into account fish farming and forestry engineering together with the Amazon farmers. Are you aware of that at all?
Not a quick translation, but those of you who like to address it may also want to repeat the questions. Mining, the first question, was it, who would like to address that?
I can try to address the first question. I don't work for the UNFCCC, so I wouldn't pretend to speak for them. But one of the things that I think has been a key focus of this process over the last 18 months really has been exactly engagement with non-state actors. And the governments of Peru and France, I think, have done an excellent job setting up what was called the Lima Paris Action Agenda, which most of you, I think, have been quite active in over the last week. There have been a whole series of action days focused on different sectors, on forests, on agriculture, lots looking at energy. I'm not quite sure how mining was reflected. I don't work directly on mining. But I think there is an intention to look at how this type of engagement continues, and especially as we look at pre-2020 action to really make sure that there is more harmonization and more engagement between governments and non-state actors, the private sector, civil society, and community organizations. So I think that's one thing that we expect to see continuing in the future in some form or another.
Second, on carbon markets, both what is the alternative source of funding? Because as Doug pointed out, in the initial when REDD came about, it was a rather simple idea. It was to fund result-based emission reduction through carbon markets. It was quite with some opposition, but most parties actually went for that in 2007, 2008. And now they're gone, maybe except in California and a few other places. So, William, it was a question for you, and maybe Dan would like to complement.
Sure. So maybe I'll try to combine my response to Doug and Michelle's question, because I think they're related. I guess in terms of REDD+ and how it was originally conceived and sort of the premise that it all required large-scale carbon finance through the carbon markets or through a carbon market, perhaps that was wrong. I guess it was, to me, more naive than wrong. That is the idea that we were going to get a grand global deal that was going to somehow create a large compliance carbon market seemed to be very much at odds with the plural, fragmented reality of the political institutional landscape of kind of pre-Copenhagen and leading into Copenhagen. And so after that, I think we've perhaps come to our senses, and we're in a very different place now with a pledge and review architecture here in Paris going forward. That still begs the question, obviously, of what REDD+ means and whether or not it can survive without large flows of finance. And I agree with Doug's assessment that things seem to be moving ahead in fits and starts and in a messier, more fragmented way. The idea that large carbon markets could emerge quickly overnight and start channeling large amounts of money to tropical forest jurisdictions seems to me to be a very, very sort of naive view of this. I can remember consultants and others standing up at conferences and saying that this was all going to be fast, easy, and cheap. It's not fast, it's not easy, and it's certainly not cheap in terms of the amount of time and effort it's going to take to make it work. But I think pivoting to Michelle's question is important here, and this is where, you know, if you accept that we're in a fragmented world and that different experiments in cap and trade and carbon markets and other types of finance are emerging in different places at different levels of governance, California becomes very important here. And for years, they've been participating in the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force and working with their partner jurisdictions and thinking about this. They have been proceeding very deliberately and very carefully, as they should. They're a very sophisticated set of regulators, and they are certainly going to take their time and do things on the schedule that they think works for them. But just last October, just a month ago, they had a workshop in Sacramento on REDD+ and released a white paper. A staff white paper was released from the Air Resources Board that sort of lays out the possibilities here. It builds on some earlier work, and a number of different GCF, Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force representatives and others were there participating in that workshop. The idea of a process going forward has not been sort of consolidated, but I think the goal is that something could come together in 2016, and for possible board action maybe in late 2016 with a host of other regulations that then could be part of or make this a part, again, a small part of the third compliance period. But no decisions have been made on that by the Air Resources Board, and there's still a chance they may decide that this is too difficult for them. I think it's a crucial experiment. I think it's a crucial leadership opportunity, because if California moved forward with this, we would learn a tremendous amount. It's proof of concept, and to the extent that it works and is effective, then that could become the DNA, if you will, that could then sort of spring up in other carbon markets that are emerging around the world. I don't think carbon market finance, though, is going to be the solution here. I think it's a small piece of funding or a small flow of funding at the end of the day. Certainly not in the near term. Maybe in the longer term we can get to that, but it's going to grow up in different places through these different fragmented systems that are emerging that ultimately can hopefully link up and harmonize. I don't think it's going to be a top-down sort of big boom type of approach. So,
Dan?
Yeah, just to add to that, to Doug's question, I think this Mato Grosso agenda, which conveniently is still on the screen, could absorb all REDD funding already existing and through 2020 and still be short of funds. And that is the agenda in 2016 for this one jurisdiction, is to figure out how to pay for those green accumulating columns, which are new forests, and restoring forests is extremely expensive. And there's not a solution to that. I think to get to the decline, it's largely command and control, new protected areas, as we've already talked about, basically saying that, you know, a lot of the big price tag used to be opportunity costs, and basically lots of opportunity costs have been shifted down to farmers where they have lost their legal right to clear farm. That's a $10 billion price tag in this state alone. And that's, I think that farmers are not waiting for full compensation of opportunity costs, just a little bit, just some recognition. They will be very happy if they can continue to grow out production and have open markets. Mato Grosso's success has not resulted in Europe just saying, bring it in. We want all your products because you guys are doing a great job of lowering deforestation. It's because there's this disconnect in definitions. So I think we're really focused on finance and all of the costs initially, which gave us some high numbers. It's still a high number, but with ABC credit line, Pronafi kicking out 10 billion reais a year of credit for smallholder farmers, there's a way of potentializing the existing credit lines and letting landholders pay part of the bill themselves. There's a big need for innovation, and I think we have not done a good job yet of translating the success in lowering deforestation, improving land tenure, lowering conflicts with communities into a perceived lower risk on the side of private investors. So private investors are still looking for 12 to 15% returns, or way higher because they just feel like anything close to the Amazon is extremely risky to be involved with. $150 million crushing plants for soy, instead of being sited in the Amazon, they go outside of the Amazon just to be, they don't want to be hit by Greenpeace. You know, that's the sort of poverty agenda that we're into right now. And I think the other question that was raised, which is basically, why don't we talk about fisheries and fruit industries? You know, these really high carbon production systems are not emitting systems as part of this agenda, and I'd say it definitely has to be. And I think REDD began as a jurisdictional approach with a national focus. We spent a lot of time focused on projects. Those projects are important, need to continue. We're now coming back to jurisdictional approach where you have that flexibility. You don't have to quantify every activity in terms of carbon emissions, because you're looking at performance across the whole state, the whole county, and eventually the whole nation. But I'll stop there.
Great. Just a small question I have for Gustavo on the, yeah?
Can I pick up on that point?
Pick up one.
So,
no, sorry.
The one thing I would like to add, though, is that, you know, there are a lot of things happening out there that are I would not say are necessarily going in the right direction. I mean, most REDD efforts do not target the main drivers of deforestation. And that may be because of finance. The fires in Indonesia aren't a mistake. It's not an accident. You know, these fires are driven by the economics of land clearing and land use in Indonesia. So I think, for me, the jury is still out on whether the financing is really shaping up in the form that's actually going to achieve the outcomes that we want to see happening. And, you know, I invite you to maybe have a discussion with Amy Duchel, who's looking much more in detail in the experiences that the projects and subnational programs, jurisdictional programs are having with how they're allocating finance, targeting finance to the underlying causes of deforestation. And there's a mismatch. So for me, it's a bit early to conclude that, you know, these other types of approaches are really having the effect that we want. There's a lot of hope now around the zero deforestation, and I bet you we're going to go through that you know, high expectation, trough of disillusionment, and maybe back to something constructive. So I think there's going to be a lot of different types of approaches, and as Dan said, we still need more innovation to get to where we're going to, but we're still not on that plane of enlightenment or plateau of constructive engagement yet. So,
good. Just one question before I let the floor for Gustavo. Peru has signed agreement with Norway, and you're part of FCPF and UNRED also, I think, program. And you have gotten some international funding. What is your expectations, and how do you see the role of big money, international money, in implementing the REDD program in Peru?
Well, we are trying to design a strategy who allow us to work with all the different actors related with deforestation, no? Because in Peru, each country is different in the circumstances of deforestation. No? In Peru, most part of deforestation is done by the small farmers. And these farmers are not owners of the forest. No? They go to the forest in the state lands, not the public lands. So from a very specific point of view, REDD, there are not beneficiaries, no? Because they are not they are not owners of the carbon, but the state, no? So for this reason, we believe in a national approach to REDD, and in this scheme, the international support is very, very important for us, and we believe that we need to design a financial mechanisms who allow us to receive payments for results in stop deforestation, and this could be a good support to reinforce the investments of the Peruvian government in the design apply of policies and measures against deforestation. And I see the possibility to have important support from the international side is very high in Peru. I guess it's a good option for us. No?
Great. We have 3 more that have lined up, maybe this side, and then you can line up. I guess we can, yeah.
Thank you.
4 or 5 more.
Thank you. I'm Larry Fahn with Sierra Club US from San Francisco. You mentioned being hit by Greenpeace. In traveling around Paris this past week, it's become apparent that there are really quite a few organizations that are dubious about REDD, some just skeptical, some critical, some outright hostile. International Forum on Globalization, the International Rights of Nature Tribunal, and in particular a lot of indigenous groups, NGOs from around the world. I don't hear any of the critics here, and I'm just wondering if it wouldn't be productive to have a livelier debate at this landscape forum by inviting some folks who have real issues. And you know, the criticism is of major different ways, you know, the massive corruption and excess profits among traders, etc. And I just thought it would be great for a forum of this nature to hear both sides and have some criticism as part of the discussion. Thank you.
I presume the critique that you're focusing, just to clarify, it is on the PES, payment for environmental services, part of REDD. Is it result-based, or are you thinking of using REDD as an offset? Because I think it's very useful for the debate, and I agree, I'm happy to have very different views here. But it is important what we mean by REDD when we have. So maybe a clarifying question for you, when you have the critique of REDD, is it of a result-based or PES system, or is it to use market funding, or is it to use REDD as an offset? Kind of 3 different issues.
I think it's all of the above. I don't have a particular position on that. I'm still open-minded. I think REDD has many great potential projects, and I would just like to hear from all sides, and there are issues of all of those 3 that you just mentioned. The market mechanism, some people are just inherently opposed to that. I'm not. But I think that it would be nice to hear a more robust debate.
Next.
Hi, Ken Andrasco from Windrock International, and I have to confess, formerly with FCPF at the World Bank, the REDD program there. I have a simple question. The experience over the last 5 years of trying to learn how to build capacity in countries to implement REDD is one that we've learned a great deal about. It's been pretty slow, difficult to get going. And my question is, in the new world we're entering for NDCs, how do we do it better? How do we make it simpler? How do we make it more landscape-based? And how do we make it so that it actually can be done in a reasonable time frame? What's the way forward once we leave here from Paris? Thanks.
That's a big question.
Hi, Chris Meyer, Environmental Defense Fund. I'm going to build a little bit off of the Sierra Club's observation around REDD projects, and I think a lot of angst expressed by critics of REDD around projects, the project methodology, the market component of them, etc. But I think what I've heard from the panel here is that there might not be a life for projects moving forward in REDD in the future. We heard Gustavo talk about Peru, the challenges of projects and integrating into or nesting into the national approach. Is there a space in financing for REDD projects, specifically going forward in the future?
Loic Lopez. I'm a free electron, just an observer, listener. It seems, as a listener, that we are in the middle of halftime of a football match or game, and people are talking about how successful the match has been, and we're still waiting for the other half. But really, we're saying it's successful because we want to see another half that's going well. But I haven't heard much of how successful REDD has been, apart from perhaps being quite heavy on red tape and people coming up with acting verbally, as you mentioned it. So where is the action in all this?
Show us the action. I just saw a nice story from a country I should not name, where a president was watching a football game, and it was in the middle of the second half, it was 0-0, and the president got bored, so he ordered the referee to cancel the game and go straight to the penalty shootout. So maybe we could do maybe we should do the same with REDD. Get it, go straight and see what is the verdict on the REDD. What has been the results so far? What's the most? Maybe we can do a round here. I think it's a good point. Why should we continue with the second half?
I think we're in the middle of a top-down approach to REDD to a bottom-up approach to REDD, and that transition is moving along very quickly. And I look in the future and I see REDD working where it's probably going to lose the name REDD, where it's owned and absorbed into and prioritized by regional societies. And I think that there's going to be place for all sorts of innovation, and if that doesn't happen, it's probably not going to succeed. But what really encourages me is that there are some really big and important places that are moving forward with this, and it's figuring into political elections, and it's figuring into the way public coffers are allocated and the way law enforcement is done. It's tilting the playing field towards the honest brokers, and I come back to Governor Pedro Takis. He spent 12 years as a public prosecutor, put a lot of people in jail, caught a lot of corruption. He walks around with a bodyguard. He has to, because he's got a price on his tag, and that's the sort of scale of risk we're talking about. If you try to tame a very unruly tropical forest frontier, and that's where all the action is, that's what REDD has to deal with, it's going to take some real bold political leadership, and they need positive signals coming in from markets. They need at least a symbolic amount of money coming in from the international climate community. They need to know that they're taking care of their people, and that's the vote. And to have a long-term view like this is a political risk. And can REDD tip the playing field so that, you know, this becomes more commonplace? And that's the second half, I think, for our free electron. Thank you.
There were a couple, well, 2-3 other questions here on the partly on the critics that should be better represented. If any, I sometimes used to say that these are my views. If you don't like them, I have others. But could we invite the audience to present the other views? I mean, to the extent that you really mean it. I would just like to add that, say that a lot of the critique, the market kind of critique of REDD is a critique of a REDD that never materialized. It's a critique of using REDD as an offset, and that has not happened. And, well, there has been just this week a debate between Norway and Brazil to what extent that could happen, and kind of clearly rejected by Brazil. And I think most countries would be unhappy to sell REDD credits in a market. So to me, it's a little bit a critique that does not have a great relevance for what's happening on the ground. Can Andrescu on INDCs ask the question, what's the way forward when we are moving from this bottom-up approach? And maybe that can be linked to the third question we ask for this session. What is the role, both from Gustavo and those working at the state, province level, national levels? What is the assistance, the help that you can get from above to make things happen on the ground? And maybe also, Christine, to put some perspectives from the top, so to speak.
I was actually the analogy of a football match, or as we would say in the US, a soccer game is apt. I think William made the point that this is a long-term game. And Dan's point, I think, is spot on. We tend to get too caught up in REDD+ as a thing. It's helpful to go back to what REDD+ is. REDD+ are efforts to reduce emissions from forests. That's it. So it's really, really hard to say that REDD+ is not a good thing. I think efforts to reduce emissions from forests, to conserve forests, to enhance forests are good. What matters is how they're done, and that's what I think a lot of the focus is on now. I think it's not simple, and this goes back a bit to Ken's point and to the points made earlier. This is hard. You ultimately are transforming rural economies. And you're transforming rural economies in ways that are more complex, I think, than was realized at the beginning. You don't just stop deforestation. You create alternatives. You create economic livelihoods for people in ways that respect cultures and respect societies. That's a pretty broad, holistic thing to do. But that's ultimately why long-term this should and can succeed. So I think as we're looking at how you actually do that, this goes back to the markets question. It's not about carbon markets. They might be a tool in some places. They may emerge. That's great. But there's a lot more focus on how do you bring in all of these different sources of support? How do you make national credit more consistent with these objectives? And Brazil has done a great job with their ABC program, their low carbon agricultural program, to begin to look at that. Mexico is doing a huge amount of work in that space. You've seen companies now starting to say, we'll support these efforts. We won't work against them, but we'll support you. You're starting to see finance industry look at this and say, we can do this as well. But then you go to where the successes have been. And I think because REDD has become more diversified, they're not quite as obvious, but they're huge when you look to the ground. And they're not all called REDD, but you've seen court decisions providing rights to indigenous peoples for the first time. You've seen titling of indigenous lands for the first time. You've seen huge new protected areas established in countries. You've seen enforcement of existing protected areas. You've seen land use planning and land zoning moving forward in places where it's been held up for years. You've seen strategies and policies put in place. You've seen capacity developed in governments and other organizations that haven't held those. You've seen monitoring systems emerge, both national monitoring systems and global independent monitoring systems. We know what's being done for the first time. That in and of itself is a huge step forward. So there's a long way to go, but I think we don't see what the success is. And I think that's the huge base we have to build on right now. And as countries themselves start to move forward with the commitments that they've put forward, the targets that they've set for themselves, it's that base of support that they have to draw on. And I think that's really encouraging.
I mean, we could extend the soccer or football metaphor a lot. I mean, some would argue that we have just created a level playing field and also set the rules, so the first half hasn't yet started. But Lou, maybe just to a final round there, what makes you optimistic? What is the success you would like to share?
I guess I'm not completely optimistic, but I try and be a little more realistic. And I think what brings some realism home is exactly what we're experiencing in Indonesia at the moment. You know, despite all of the progress we've seen with national level monitoring, with policies put in place, demonstration activities happening at subnational scale and jurisdictional approaches to REDD. You know, the MRV system was developed for REDD, is now being scaled up to cover all AFLU in the country. These are positive things, and then you have the event like we have the fires and the catastrophe that's happening there. There are a whole host of reasons for Indonesia to solve the fires, and there's a whole host of interest aligned against Indonesia solving that problem. And so there's cause for cautious optimism. I think because you do see countries undertaking, you know, the DRC has undertaken some interesting forestry reforms in its forestry laws. very positive things, and a lot of which is being promoted by the interest in REDD. A whole host of countries. Vietnam is doing a lot around this. Countries are paying attention to it. The discourse is changing. And we know that real change often follows discourses. And so we can take some optimism from the discourse, but we also need to realize that there are entrenched, powerful interests in the status quo. And the constellation of actions, the constellation of human and financial resources is not yet there to change the equation of how people make decisions about land. So there's still a lot to be overcome. So if I'm optimistic, it's cautious optimism because I'm by nature an optimistic person, but there's a lot of reasons there to be cautious as well.
William, short for the two last?
Very short, yes. So what was the question? What gives me hope?
Something like that.
Yes. So many. Yeah. No. Just in my experience, and again, working with these subnational jurisdictions, what gives me an enormous amount of hope and where I see all kinds of opportunities is the remarkable work that these state and provincial government civil servants and their civil society partners are doing and have been doing for many years. They are underfinanced, underappreciated, working out on these unruly tropical frontiers that Dan is talking about, and they're the ones that are really doing so much of the hard work. They're a true inspiration to all of us in the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force. That's not to take anything away from the political leadership, and I think what Governor Brown and other governors are doing with the Under 2 MOU and with all of these initiatives that we're seeing, it's incredibly important. But I'll just come back to what I was saying earlier. It's really the civil servants and their civil society partners and the network that holds this together and keeps it moving forward. It's very fragile in a lot of places. There are a lot of threats for sure, but I find so much to be hopeful about in working with these people in so many different places and watching them work together and share their experiences across different jurisdictions, learning from each other and feeling like they're part of something much larger. That's obviously not going to solve the problem by itself. A lot of other things have to come together for sure, but I feel like that's a big and important and underappreciated piece of this.
Well, in Peru, we're very aware that the importance of include this REDD and other tools to reduce deforestation. In our intended indices, more than 60% must come from a follow sector. And the two main tools are to promote the investment, the private investment in agricultural transformational change and also REDD. So we believe this is very, very important, and that it is very possible also.
Great. We're going to close. Just have a couple of words. To me, the whole background for being involved is like my former minister said, we're doing REDD because it's important, not because it's easy. And if you believe in climate change and the projections, we cannot reach a 2-degree target without doing REDD. Doing REDD as an objective, doing REDD in terms of reducing emissions, that's what it says. So the question is not, are you in favor of REDD or not? When I'm asked that question, I typically reply that, do you mean, am I against reducing emissions? No, I'm strongly favoring that. And then how we do REDD is the key question. And that it's a huge policy experiment. A lot of money being put in, trying out pests, trying out command and controls, working with communities and stakeholders in a way that has not been tried. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned, and we need, I think, not to fall in love with our ideologies or perceived recipes for how to solve this, but being a learning mode. So I hope you have learned a little bit and maybe changed slightly your views during this session and during the Landscape Forum. Then it has been a success. I would like to thank the 5 panelists for excellent contributions and new insights. And we are meeting for the final plenary here in just 10 minutes.